Thank you for joining me today. During the years the Duquesne steel mill was finding its way into the hands of Andrew Carnegie, a British industrialist found his way to Washington Territory, where he started to carve a town and steel mill out of the frontier to become the Pittsburgh of the West. The Englishman was Peter Kirk, who was born in 1840 to a family who had operated an iron foundry for 100 years in Chaplin-le-Frith, England. This little hamlet enjoyed proximity to Manchester, considered the world's first industrial city. The earliest recorded date for the Kirk family ironworks is 1770, just as the Industrial Revolution began. But the family may have been involved in the iron business as early as 1727. Peter learned the iron business from the ground up by working in the foundry with his father, brothers, uncles, and cousins from an early age. For unknown reasons, Peter's father left the family business and struck out on his own, taking his children north to Stockport. The family soon moved farther north to Workington, where Peter and his brothers set up a wrought iron foundry. Peter was the youngest of the Kirk brothers, and he also left the family enterprise with his brother-in-law, Charles Valentine, to set up their own ironworks. The partners showed initiative, forward thinking, and a tendency for efficiency. In 1877, they built one of the first Bessemer steel plants in Workington, and early on used ladle cars to directly transport the molten ore from the blast furnaces to the Bessemer converters. Their enterprise, Moss Bay Hematite Iron and Steel Company, became a very successful rail producer. This is Peter Kirk in his later years. And this is Moss Bay Hematite Iron and Steel Company in Workington. It shows the blast furnaces, and the foundry and mill would be off to the left. This is a sample of one of his rails. This rail is actually still in the ground in front of the Northwest Railway Museum in Snoqualmie. And the rail producers always stamped their company logo, the date, and the weight of the rail. Moss Bay's success was fueled by a multitude of inventions Peter Kirk patented starting in 1866 when he was just 26 years old. The patents mainly addressed fuel and labor-saving technology, but also included new rail products. His first patent improved the rolling mill by adding an adjustable three-roll system to enable additional rolling of the bloom before it had to be reheated. Kirk improved on this design with more patents over the years that included hydraulic tables to raise and lower the metal, and additional sets of rollers above to either side and within close horizontal proximity. This is a diagram from that first invention, and you can see the bloom going in, and it would come out the other side, be lowered down, and go through the rolls down at this side and come back out on the same side that it was put in. This is the culmination of a number of patents that he put together with the rolling mills, and you can see the different additions that he made. By 1882, Peter Kirk claimed in this combination system, quote, "By means of my invention, I am enabled at one heat to roll a very heavy bloom, say about 15 inches square, into a rail long enough to cut up into 6 or more rails," end quote. This is significant in that the usual process called for the bloom to pass several times through each of the blooming, roughing, and finishing mills, usually requiring a reheat between each one. The heat produced to smelt iron was a commodity, and Kirk strove to put it to use whenever possible. He fueled 26 of the 30 steam engines in his Moss Bay steelworks with the latent heat of his 4 blast furnaces. He patented improvements to his heating systems that included automatic feeding of the coke and specially designed grates to allow the embers to fall through the ash pit. He delayed the removal of the embers so he could force air over the ash pit to insulate the blast furnace with that late heated air. Adding more air also improved the burning of the fuel. In 1884, he devised a cellular furnace where the ingots were transported by crane directly from the molds to the cells for more even cooling and thus a better quality steel. From there, the ingots were directly transported to the rolling mills. Kirk also registered patents for new rail products and the machines to make them. He devised a tram rail that could be produced with ordinary rolling mills, which offered a great savings to the tram producers. One of his most successful products was his combined chair and sleeper. A sleeper is a railroad tie, and the chair is the metal fitting that attaches the rail to the tie. Being constructed of steel, this product was more durable for wet climates than regular wood ties. It also enabled railroad construction crews to lay their lines with less parts and in a faster manner than before. Kirk registered these patents all over Europe and the United States. The steel Moss Bay produced was of exceptional quality and sought after around the world. 160,000 of his combined chair and sleepers were delivered to Bombay in 1886 alone. Moss Bay steel rails helped build the Canadian Pacific Railway, and in the early 1880s, Central Pacific Railroad laid 25 miles of Kirk's rails on their Visalia line in California. 60 miles of Moss Bay steel were laid for the Mexico, Tonia, and Tabasco Railway. These are just a few of the contracts we're aware of. And to this day, the rails have been found in New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Borneo, and all over England. It is with this reputation that Peter Kirk came to America in the fall of 1886. The British iron market once dominated the world, but had been dwindling for years as America expanded her coast-to-coast rail system. American tariffs also made it difficult for foreign producers to compete. Peter Kirk came to the US to investigate building a subsidiary to gain a foothold into America's exploding development. He planned a grand tour of North America's industrial plants. When he arrived in New York, he learned of the quality ore of the Denny mines in the Cascade Mountains on the opposite coast through a sale of rails to the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern Railroad. He added an extension to his fact-finding mission to cross the continent to Washington Territory. He spent much time investigating the mines and other resources in the Pacific Northwest. He found there was an abundance of ore, but some of it was substandard. The coal needed to be washed to make it workable. These were problems that chemistry could solve. The limestone was abundant and didn't seem to cause concern. Kirk saw the great promise of the area. The Western US was still expanding, and he saw the bigger picture of the West Coast access to supply the Asian and South American markets that were on the brink of their own expansion. The nearest competitor was 1,600 miles away to the east. He estimated the demand to be great, considering the new markets, new lines, and replacement rails for the existing Western US railroads. Kirk planned to build a steel mill with a capacity of 3,000 tons a week, like his England plant, and far exceeding anything on the West Coast. But there were problems. He got tangled up in a frontier town rivalry between Seattle, who controlled the best iron deposits, and Tacoma, who controlled the most rail infrastructure with Northern Pacific Railroad. To have access to the high quality iron ore, he had to make Seattle the place of production and distribution. But Northern Pacific had the railroad miles and a huge ore deposit in Cle Elum to its advantage. Kirk's status as an immigrant also caused wrinkles in his plan. He had many backers in England, but if the new company was funded mainly with foreign capital, the law considered it foreign and subject to the tariffs Kirk was trying to avoid. He finally decided on the east side of Lake Washington as the location of the new mill with the help of Lee S.J. Hunt, owner of the Seattle Daily Post-Intelligencer. But Kirk kept his options open by brokering a deal with Northern Pacific to haul coal from his Durham holdings that included a clause for a possible steel mill in the future at Cle Elum. In the summer of 1888, frantic work began to build the fledgling town of Kirkland and its mill site, which was where the present day Costco now sits. Kirk bought machinery and supplies, about 5,600 tons worth, that was stored on site. The foundry, machine shop, pattern shop, and blacksmith shop were all completed, along with ore bunkers. This shows the machine shop, blacksmith shop, and pattern shop. You can see some railroad ties there. They're building an internal line in front of it. That same building is on the left side, or on the right side, with the foundry in the middle. You can see the railroad coming beside it to the ore bunkers that are pictured on the far left. They had to build the town from scratch, and there were plans for several brick buildings for the downtown area. And this is one that was sponsored by Joshua Sears and was going to be the bank. Kirk hoped for an industrial center in the area, and soon a sawmill, brickworks, and woolen factory appeared. The Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern Railroad built a line to Kirkland, but for some reason hesitated to build a line to the rich Denny ore deposits. Kirk's project struggled with capital. The Seattle fire of 1889 didn't help. And within a few years, the financial panic of 1893 strangled the whole operation before any of the 4 proposed blast furnaces were even constructed. Kirk and his family stayed in Kirkland for another decade until a family tragedy urged them to move to their summer home on San Juan Island, where Peter owned a large sheep ranch. Even after the mill failure, Peter Kirk hoped for success. He told the Yakima Herald in 1899, quote, "We invested $300,000 in building the ironworks in Kirkland in Seattle suburbs years ago. But the outcome of any profit is buried in the womb of the future," end quote. This prophetic statement seems to have come true. Kirkland remained a sleepy Seattle suburb until recently. The attractiveness of Lake Washington's east side and proximity to Boeing and Microsoft's campus has increased Kirkland's popularity. One feature of Kirkland's appeal is that Peter Kirk's engineers platted the town so that a great many of the house lots gave the owner a $1 million view of the lake and surrounding area. Thank you for joining me today.